Right now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is at the White House, and he's having dinner with Donald Trump. On the agenda, discussing a possible ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the future of combating Iran's nuclear ambitions. Joining us now to discuss it all is Senator Coons of Delaware. He's a Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Senator Coons, if you were the president of the United States, what is the conversation you would be having with Prime Minister Netanyahu tonight?
I would be pressing Prime Minister Netanyahu very hard to finally come to a ceasefire, to secure humanitarian aid and relief for the suffering Palestinian people of Gaza, to secure the release of the remaining nearly 24 living hostages, and to put together a framework for achieving lasting peace for the Middle East. After the strikes on Iran, after President Trump showed he was willing to take great risks to support Netanyahu's direction and agenda, and frankly, after Hezbollah, Iran, and Hamas have all been significantly weakened by military action, the president should be pushing Netanyahu to finally recognize it's time for this war in Gaza, started by Hamas nearly 2 years ago on October 7th, to be brought to an end.
Senator, I'd agree with that. I could see President Coons making that point and stressing that point, but President Trump
That's the first time I've ever heard that phrase.
Well, President Trump is not President Coons. And so my question to you, sir, is this is this more of the tail wagging the dog? You've got so many other narratives that are really kind of driving both the storylines around Gaza and what's happening there, as well as Iran. For example, you've got headlines: Israeli officials think Trump could give them a green light to attack Iran again, noting Israeli officials say Netanyahu wants to reach understandings with Trump about future U.S. nuclear negotiations with Iran and on possible scenarios that would justify renewed Israeli military strikes. So it seems like the policy is being set by Netanyahu, as opposed to, as you've described it, the president sort of laying down what needs to happen in order for the U.S. to continue to back efforts in both Gaza and Iran.
Look, there is a real chance here for lasting regional peace. And Netanyahu just needs to grasp that moment. And President Trump needs to press him to grasp that moment. Netanyahu, for his own personal reasons, has long placed securing the release of the hostages still held in Gaza by Hamas below a lot of other objectives. But he's got the chance now to achieve what is a significant path forward, which is reconciliation with Saudi Arabia, a very real end to the Arab-Israeli conflict, now decades old, and a lasting security and economic alignment between Israel and most of the Gulf states, most of the Arab states of the region. But he cannot do that without a credible path forward towards Palestinian self-governance. If President Trump gives him the kinds of assurances of Israeli security and of lasting American support that I expect Netanyahu is seeking, then he ought to be demanding in return a real path towards peace, something Netanyahu has just refused to pursue for several years.
This is the draft proposal, and these are details sent by one of the Hamas mediators to that were obtained by the Associated Press. This truce would last 60 days. There would be the release of 10 living hostages, release of the remains of 18 hostages, Palestinian prisoners exchanged for Israeli hostages, ramped up humanitarian aid entering Gaza. Israeli forces would withdraw to a buffer zone and start negotiations to end the war. All that being said, look, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu does not believe in the security of the Palestinian people, in a Palestinian state. He doesn't believe in that. And so and we're looking at live photos right now of the dinner that is happening between President Trump and Netanyahu. We're going to ask the control room if we have audio, and if so, we will bring it. But we have audio, so we'll dip in. Are we dipping in? We're going to monitor, and then we'll dip in shortly. But, Senator, I guess I have to ask you, Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition is a conservative, a right-wing coalition that one of their tenets is that not only they don't believe in a two-state solution. So how exactly is the peace everyone is talking about going to come to fruition?
It is exceptionally difficult, and it is almost impossible with the current governing coalition. Two members of Netanyahu's cabinet, Minister Smotrich and Minister Ben-Gvir, have said repeatedly that they will leave the government, which could cause it to collapse if he were to go ahead with anything resembling peace with the Palestinians. But Yair Lapid and several opposition leaders have recently said they would join a government of national unity if that's what it takes to achieve a lasting peace in Gaza and to forestall a possible annexation attempt of the West Bank. This is a critical moment. And the very conservative, very right-wing coalition that supports the Netanyahu government will not make peace, a lasting peace with the Palestinians. You're absolutely right about that, Symone. So, you know, frankly, the United States has a chance here to help broker what could be an enduring peace. And a key part of that is negotiations with Iran. President Trump was far too quick to declare mission accomplished, just like George Bush in the first months after the war in Iraq, and to declare that all of Iran's nuclear weapons program, its enrichment program, forgive me, had been obliterated. We don't know that for sure yet. We need to get credible, nonpartisan, non-political intelligence from the ground in Iran, and that requires getting inspectors back into these facilities. And so I'm encouraged that there is an opening towards negotiations with Iran by a senior representative of the Trump administration. But that's the path forward here, is to secure a lasting end to Iran's nuclear enrichment program and to try and deal with their ballistic missiles and their support for terrorist proxies in the region. If what Trump and Netanyahu are talking about is that sort of a concerted effort to negotiate a lasting end to Iran's threat to Israel's existence, that should be a significant step forward for those concerned about the stability and security of Israel and of peace in the region.
Senator, just real quick, because we want to go to some other topics here, but to that headline that Michael popped up from Axios about the fact that Israeli officials think that the president could give them a green light to attack Iran again. If the president attacks Iran again without congressional approval, what then does Congress do?
Well, we just took a vote last week on whether or not a majority of the Senate would authorize additional use of force against Iran. And I was part of the coalition that voted not to give that authorization. It's a more convoluted framing. I don't want to get tied up in the specific language. But the larger point here is that the Trump administration has the time, has the ability to come to Congress and say, here's what we believe are the threats in Iran to American national interest and national security. Here's our path forward, and here's the circumstances under which we would ask you for authorization to use more military force to truly end Iran's enrichment program. I think they should do that. They should come and consult with Congress, and we should give them a fair chance at persuading members of Congress that there is a credible argument to be made for that. I'm very skeptical that more military action against Iran, particularly targeting enriched uranium, given the dangers involved in that, is the right choice. But as I said a moment ago, that's why this is the moment for us to look to the IAEA, the inspections organization of the UN that has long been on the ground in Iran inspecting, and to look towards diplomacy as a way to try and prevent Iran from seeking partners or allies like Russia or North Korea or Pakistan in restarting and racing towards a nuclear weapon.
Senator, you've got the president at this moment complaining at this dinner about countries and their tariffs, and certainly, again, the president today pushing his tariff timeline back now to August 1st. The back and forth, just the disjointedness of this president's ability to sort of just tell us what he wants and stick to it. It's frustrating for a lot of business owners out there. It's frustrating for a lot of folks around the globe. But in the midst of all of the tariff talk, in the midst of the conversations about Iran and Gaza, there is still the little matter of Ukraine. And you have headlines
Yes.
screaming today, Ukraine reports at least 11 dead and over 80 injured in continued Russian attacks. You have Pete Hegseth just unilaterally deciding that the aid that was planned to go to help the Ukrainians, he decided, no, we're not doing that now because somehow it was going to diminish our capacity and our readiness, which is bogus. Senator, what's left to be done at this point to help the Ukrainians and to help President Zelensky when you have an administration that just doesn't give a damn about them, their plight, or the integral part they play in the security of Europe and the West?
So, Michael, we have the same problem here with the Trump administration's policy with regards to Ukraine and Russia that we do with the Trump administration's policy, the president's policy, with regards to tariffs. It's unpredictable. It's on again, off again. Some were jokingly saying Taco Tuesday came early this week because Trump always chickens out on imposing tough tariffs. He announced that he's going to impose huge tariffs on Japan and South Korea and defer for another month tariffs on a dozen other countries. He had promised he would negotiate 90 tariff deals in 90 days, and he's got nearly 2. So, frankly, he is failing to deliver predictable, forceful, clear messaging or policy on tariffs. Even more urgently, we need to support Ukraine. The United States has more than enough munitions to provide support for Ukraine on the battlefield through 155 artillery munitions and Stinger missiles that really are not critical to the national defense of the United States in terms of our magazine, our stockpile, and our reserves. And I think Secretary Hegseth needs to deliver a compelling answer to those of us in Congress who have publicly and privately called for a briefing tomorrow that explains what justifies this abrupt reversal. Just 2 weeks ago, President Trump met with President Zelensky of Ukraine at the NATO summit. They had a very positive meeting. President Zelensky came away believing he had a commitment to provide air defense. President Putin continues to push and push and push. He will not accept the unconditional ceasefire that Zelensky has accepted. And Putin keeps raining down hundreds of missiles and drones on civilian targets in Ukraine every night. So, frankly, Michael, if we're going to continue to be credible as a part of the Western world, as a nation that can be counted on to support the fight for freedom in Europe by Ukraine, we need to deliver the air defense interceptors they desperately need. And if we're to be believed as an economic power, President Trump needs to pick a path forward on tariffs and stick to them. I frankly think he has overreached in tariffs and has underperformed in defending Ukraine.
All right.